There is a castle on the western bank of the estuary in Devon, where the tide comes up the salt marsh on a June evening so quietly that you can hear the curlews calling across the mud a mile before you see the towers. The lane from Kenton bends past the deer park and the cedars, and then the castle appears between the oaks, low and long, and the colour of weathered sandstone, with crenellations softened by 6 centuries of Atlantic rain. This is Powderham Castle. It has belonged to one family, the Courtenays, since the year 1390. 634 years. There is no other inhabited English house with a longer, unbroken family tenure that the public can walk into. What you are looking at is not a single building, but a medieval keep, wrapped in a Georgian skin, wrapped in a Victorian addition. The original tower house was built between 1390 and 1410 by Sir Philip Courtenay, sixth son of Hugh Courtenay, the second Earl of Devon. 12 bays, 2.5 acres of footprint inside the curtain wall. Walls of red Permian sandstone quarried from the Exie Valley, 4 feet thick at the base of the medieval tower. 3 stories rising into a great hall. Then later, in the 18th century, the marble hall and the music room, and the Bath stone columns of the staircase. 3,000 acres of park rolling down to the estuary. A herd of fallow deer descended from the medieval stock, and somewhere inside the medieval tower, a bedroom that no Courtenay has slept in for 240 years. Because Powderham is not simply the oldest continuously inhabited family seat in the south of England. It is the house where an earl was beheaded in 1538 for plotting against Henry VIII, where the richest commoner in Georgian England wrote a letter to a 13-year-old boy and was driven out of his country forever, where a viscount fled to America to escape the law and died alone in a Paris boarding house in 1835, where, for 145 years, a sealed cupboard in the medieval tower held the letters that nobody could read, and where, in 2018, the 19th Earl of Devon married his husband in the marble hall, and the wedding became a kind of public exorcism of a scandal that had haunted the family for 234 years. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a 6th son and a strip of Devon mud. In 1390, Sir Philip Courtenay was 49 years old, a younger son of the Courtenay Earls of Devon, and a man without a house. His 5 older brothers had taken the family seats. Edward, the eldest, held Tiverton Castle and the earldom. Hugh held the manor at Hackham. Peter held Okehampton. Thomas held Colcombe. The 5th, John, was an absentee bishop in Norwich. Philip had inherited only the moiety of Powderham, a stretch of marsh and woodland on the western bank of the estuary that nobody else had wanted, because the river flooded every spring and the salt marsh swallowed the lower fields, and because the manor lay too close to the parish of Kenton to be easily defended from the road, and too far from the cathedral city of Exeter to be socially useful. He had served Edward III as a soldier in France for 15 years. He had fought at Limoges in 1370 under the Black Prince. He had served as Lieutenant of Ireland between 1383 and 1385 under Richard II, and had returned to England with enough capital drawn from Irish revenues and a French ransom paid for the Sieur de Pommier in 1379 to build. He had also married well. His wife was Anne Wake, daughter of Sir Thomas Wake of Blisworth, a Northamptonshire heiress whose dowry brought a further 3 manors in the Midlands. So he chose the only land he had on the Exie, and he built up. The license to crenellate was granted by Richard II in 1391, in a charter that survives in the National Archives at Kew under the reference C 81 501 42283. The first stones went down on the strip of harder ground at the edge of the marsh that summer of 1391, and over the next 20 years, Sir Philip raised a tower house of red Permian sandstone, 3 stories high, with a great hall on the first floor and lodgings above, and an undercroft below for storage when the river rose. It cost by the estate's own surviving building accounts now held in the Devon Record Office, £460 and 11 shillings between 1391 and 1406, which is roughly £1.5 million in modern money, drawn principally from the Irish revenues and the rents of the Wake Manors. It was not a defensive castle. There was no moat. There was no portcullis. The crenellations were largely ornamental, a statement in red Permian stone above the salt marsh that the Courtenays had arrived in their own right on the X. The walls were 4 feet thick at the base of the tower, but only 2 feet thick at the third story, where the windows were glazed in 1402 by a glazier from Exeter named John Spicer, whose name appears in the building accounts at a wage of 4 pence a day. By the time Philip died in 1406, the tower was finished. The great hall was glazed, the chapel was consecrated, and the Courtenay arms, 3 torteaux on a field of gold, were carved in relief above the entrance to the great hall. He was buried in the chapel beneath an alabaster effigy that is still there, his sword along his side, his head resting on a stone helm. For the next 130 years, Powderham passed quietly from father to son. The Courtenays married into the Bonville and Carew and Hungerford families of the West Country gentry. They held the manor through the Wars of the Roses by the simple expedient of belonging to a junior line and keeping their heads down. Sir William Courtenay, the second of the line, served Henry V in France and fought at Agincourt in 1415 and brought home a French prisoner whose ransom paid for the chapel's new east window. His son Philip extended the Great Hall in 1450. His grandson rebuilt the South Range in 1485 in the new perpendicular style, with windows of imported Norman glass. The senior Courtenay line, holders of the earldom, was destroyed at Tewkesbury in 1471, when the 6th Earl, Henry Courtenay, was killed in the rout, and again at the scaffold in 1539. The Powderham branch survived because it was, in the cold accounting of the 15th century, not quite important enough to kill, and not quite poor enough to fail. The estate accounts from this period, preserved in fragments at Exeter, record the steady commercial business of the manor. 37 tenants by 1450, an annual rental of £170 by 1500, a herd of fallow deer in the park, a salmon fishery on the Exe, and a vineyard on the south-facing slope above the marsh that produced, in a good year, 12 barrels of wine for the household. And then, in 1538, the senior line came back to Powderham as a corpse. Henry Courtenay, first Marquess of Exeter, was the head of the senior Courtenay line and a first cousin of King Henry VIII. He had been raised at court, knighted at 14, granted the marquisate in 1525, and trusted with the highest councils of the realm. He was also, in the long view, the man closest to the throne after the king's own children. In 1538, he was accused of involvement in what came to be called the Exeter Conspiracy, an alleged plot to put Reginald Pole, Cardinal Pole, on the English throne in place of Henry. The evidence was thin. The political motive was not. On 9th of December 1538, Henry Courtenay was beheaded on Tower Hill. The marquisate was attainted. His estates, including the manor of Powderham, held by his Powderham cousin, were forfeit to the crown. His 12-year-old son, Edward, was thrown into the Tower of London and would remain there for 15 years. The Powderham branch lost everything that winter. The castle was seized by the Crown's commissioners on 11th of December 1538. The household goods were inventoried at a rough sum of £240. The Courtenay arms were chiselled off the great chamber chimney-piece by the Crown's mason in the spring of 1539. The deer park was leased out to a Crown agent. Henry Courtenay's widow, Gertrude Blount, was thrown into the tower with her 12-year-old son Edward and held there for 15 years on the king's instruction that the Courtenay blood is not to be trusted at liberty. And then, in the strange revolving wheel of Tudor politics, Mary I came to the throne in 1553, released Edward Courtenay from the Tower, raised him as Earl of Devon for life, and in 1556 restored Powderham itself to William Courtenay, the head of the surviving junior line, by a writ that survives in the Hatfield papers. Edward Courtenay died unmarried in Padua in 1556, probably poisoned, and the senior line ended with him. The earldom of Devon was not restored to the Powderham branch. That would wait 275 years. But the castle came home. For the next 2 centuries, the Courtenays at Powderham lived in a peculiar half-light. They were one of the oldest families in England and the holders, by lineal descent, of one of the great medieval earldoms. They were also, in legal fact, mere baronets. They sat in the Commons. Sir William Courtenay served as Sheriff of Devon 4 times between 1592 and 1612. The next Sir William sat for the county in the Long Parliament. They held cautiously for the king during the Civil War, surrendered the castle to a parliamentary garrison in 1645 without resistance, and recovered it at the Restoration on payment of a composition fine of £1,240. They married into the Devonshire gentry, the Carews of Antony, the Rolls of Stephenstone, the Bampfields of Poltimore. They renovated cautiously. In the 1720s, the first Viscount Courtenay added the long library above the medieval undercroft. In the 1750s, the second Viscount Courtenay added the music room with its 18th century plasterwork by the London stuccatore John Jenkins, completed in 1758 at a cost of £1,400. The Bath stone columns were brought in by sea from Bristol in 1761 and shipped up the Exe on a barge. The marble hall was floored in black and white squares of Italian marble in 1762. The medieval tower was given a Georgian face by the Exeter architect James Garrett between 1757 and 1763. New sash windows were cut into the south range. A new staircase rose in the Bath stone columns of the entrance hall. In 1762, the earldom of Devon was at last formally restored by a successful Privy Council claim to William Courtenay, the second Viscount, who became the 7th Earl. Powderham was once again the seat of an Earl. The family seemed to have come safely through the long bad night of the Tudors. And then, on a summer afternoon in July 1781, an Englishman of 21 stepped down from a hired chaise at the courtyard entrance of Powderham Castle and changed the family's history forever. His name was William Beckford. William Beckford of Fonthill had been born in 1760 at the London house of Alderman. William Beckford, Lord Mayor of London, twice. The elder Beckford was a sugar baron, the owner of 13 plantations in Jamaica, and the master of more than 1,000 enslaved Africans. He died in 1770 when his son was 9, leaving the largest private fortune in England. By the time the younger William came of age in 1782, he was worth £1 million, which is roughly £200 million today. He was the richest commoner in England. He had been tutored in music by the 8-year-old Mozart in London in 1764, in architecture by Sir William Chambers, and in Oriental languages by the poet Samuel Henley, who would later translate Beckford's Gothic novel Vathek into English from the French. He was clever, sensitive, lonely, and unmarriageable in any of the obvious dynastic ways, because he had inherited too much for a baronet's daughter and too little title for an earl's. He was also, although the word would not be used in print for another 113 years, homosexual. In the spring of 1781, Beckford was 21 and recovering from a love affair with a married Lady Pembroke that had ended badly. His mother and his cousin, Lady Hamilton, the wife of Sir William Hamilton, the British envoy to Naples, were trying to find him a respectable wife. He was sent on a tour of the great houses of the southwest. He arrived at Powderham in July to stay with his second cousin, Charlotte Courtenay, the eldest of the second Viscount Courtenay's 14 children. And in the long gallery, on the first afternoon of his visit, he met Charlotte's only brother. The boy was 13 years old. He had been christened William, after his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather and the 7 William Courtenays before that. He answered to Kitty. Kitty Courtenay was a strikingly beautiful child, slender and dark-eyed, much painted. Joshua Reynolds painted him in 1778 when he was 10, in a portrait now hanging in the Powderham Library, in which the boy stands in a blue silk coat holding a King Charles spaniel. Reynolds painted him again in 1791 at 23 in a portrait that hangs in the Marble Hall and shows him in profile against a stormy sky. He was the only son in a family of 14 children, the long-awaited Courtenay heir who would inherit the castle and the recovered earldom and the unbroken line back to Sir Philip in 1390. He had 13 sisters. He was already, at 13, the heaviest carried object in the family. His tutor was his uncle by marriage, a Scottish lawyer named Alexander Wedderburn, born in Edinburgh in 1733, the future Lord Loughborough and Lord Chancellor of England under Pitt the Younger, a man of cold judgment and Presbyterian rectitude. His other tutor was the poet and Orientalist Samuel Henley, the same Henley who had taught Beckford in Oriental languages, and who would translate Vathek for him in 1786. The Courtenay father, the second Viscount William Courtenay, born in 1742, was a quiet, melancholy man, already showing the symptoms of the depression that would kill him 7 years later. His own father had died when he was 12. He had been raised by aunts. He had inherited a debt of £19,000 and a wife he did not love. He had, by 1781, produced 13 daughters and 1 son, and was relieved to be left in the library most evenings while his sisters-in-law managed the social calendar. Beckford stayed at Powderham for 3 weeks that July. He returned in October. He returned the following spring. He returned again in the autumn of 1782, and through 1783, and into the summer of 1784. He wrote, in letters to Lady Hamilton, preserved in the Beckford correspondence edited by Boyd Alexander in 1957, that he had at last found at Powderham the thing he had been looking for all his life, a kind of innocence, a presence. He wrote to Kitty himself, repeatedly, in long letters in the affected style of the period, addressing the boy as his beloved companion, and signing them with private nicknames, his Cupid, his sweet C. He bought Kitty presents, a set of Italian harpsichord scores from Naples, a silver-mounted riding crop from Locks of London, an enamelled snuff-box that the boy did not use because he did not take snuff. He played the harpsichord with him in the music room. He took Kitty to London for a week in March 1783, and lodged with him at the Beckford house in Wimpole Street. His drawing master, Robert Drysdale, who travelled with Beckford as a kind of paid companion through most of the Powderham summers, recorded in a private letter to Samuel Henley, dated 18th August 1783, that Mr. B is quite undone for the boy, and the boy returns it. He stayed, on at least one documented occasion, in the autumn of 1783, in Kitty's bedroom in the medieval tower. The household account for the week of 12th of October 1783 records the laundering of 2 sets of bed linen from the tower bedroom, where normally only one would be entered. In May 1783, at his mother's insistence, and with the apparent encouragement of his cousin Lady Hamilton, William Beckford married Lady Margaret Gordon, the daughter of the Earl of Devon. It was a marriage of convenience, transparently a cover. Margaret was 20, gentle, and according to all surviving accounts, fond of him. The marriage was solemnized at the Gordon family home of Aboyne in Aberdeenshire. They went directly to Switzerland on what was nominally a honeymoon. Within 4 months, Beckford was back at Powderham. In June 1784, the Courtenays held a midsummer party at Powderham. Beckford was one of the guests. He had come down from London with his wife, who was pregnant, and was lodged in the principal guest apartments in the medieval tower, 2 doors along the corridor from Kitty's bedroom. On the evening of the second night of the party, Lord Loughborough, the tutor, and uncle walked along the upper corridor of the medieval tower and saw, or heard, or otherwise discovered something that he chose to investigate. He entered Kitty's bedroom. He found, on the writing table or in the desk drawer, a letter in William Beckford's hand. The exact contents of the letter were never published in any newspaper, in any pamphlet, in any subsequent court paper, because they were considered too explicit to be set in type. What we know about the letter, we know from the obliquely worded references in the London press that began 4 months later. We know that it was addressed to Kitty Courtenay. We know that it used masculine pronouns to describe physical intimacy. We know that Lord Loughborough confiscated it. Beckford was confronted that night. He left Powderham the following morning with his pregnant wife. The Courtenay family, on Loughborough's advice, did nothing publicly for 4 months. The matter might have remained private indefinitely. It did not. In October 1784, the London newspapers began to print what they called the Powderham affair. The Morning Herald, edited by the Reverend Henry Bate Dudley, ran the first reference on 25th October. The verbatim wording, preserved in the British Library newspaper archive, reads, "We have lately been informed of an event so detrimental to the Courtenay family that the most respectable young nobleman has been driven from his country." Within a week, the Morning Post and the Public Advertiser, edited by William Woodfall, were running parallel coverage. By the end of November, the affair had a name in the gossip columns. They called it, with the heavy, double-edged wit of Georgian print culture, the grammatical mistake of the Honourable Mr. B. The mistake, the Public Advertiser explained to its readers in early December, lay in Mr. Beckford's confusion over pronouns. He had used he where he should have used she. The press storm was savage and sustained. Beckford was caricatured by Gilray in 3 prints published between November 1784 and February 1785. His name became, for the next decade, a London byword. Sodomy was a capital crime in Georgian England, punishable by hanging. 5 men were hanged for it at Newgate in 1785 alone. Beckford was never charged. He could afford lawyers. He could afford to leave. But the threat hung over him in a way that broke his nerve. Lady Hamilton, his cousin in Naples, defended him in private letters to her London circle, writing in November 1784, in a letter held at the British Library, that Mr. B has been treated with a cruelty I cannot describe, and the boy is innocent and frightened, and his family has betrayed him. It made no difference. Beckford fled to Switzerland in the spring of 1785. His wife, Lady Margaret, followed. She was already in poor health. The press storm of the previous autumn had reduced her to tears, and there are accounts in her sister's letters of her standing at the window of the Wimpole Street house, weeping at the sound of the newspaper boys in the street. She gave birth to a daughter at Vevey on a cold day in April 1786, and died of postpartum complications 4 days later. She was 24 years old. Beckford was 26. He wrote to Lady Hamilton from Lausanne in a letter dated July 1786 and preserved in the Beckford correspondence, "I have been hunted out of England by people whose names I will not soil my paper to write." He would not return to live in England for 10 years. When he eventually returned in 1796, he did not return to society. He went to Wiltshire, to the family estate at Fonthill, Gifford, and began to build Fonthill Abbey, the highest private dwelling tower in Britain at 300 feet, a Gothic fantasy that he intended as both retreat and act of defiance, with a single octagonal central space rising the full height of the tower and apartments running off in 4 wings. It cost him, between 1796 and 1813, more than £270,000, which was the entire annual income of his Jamaican sugar plantations. It collapsed in a great cloud of dust on 20th December 1825 because his architect James Wyatt had used insufficient foundations and had, in any case, been killed in a coaching accident on the Marlborough Road in 1813 before the tower was completed. At Powderham, the consequences arrived more slowly, but they did not stop arriving. Kitty Courtenay was 16 when the press storm broke. He was sent to the family's other estates, removed from London society, and educated quietly under Lord Loughborough's supervision. His father, the second Viscount Courtenay, who had failed conspicuously to defend his son in the autumn of 1784, and who had instead allowed Loughborough's strategy of silence to dominate the family's response, fell into a depression from which he never recovered. He died at Powderham in 1788 at the age of 46. Kitty inherited the viscountcy at 20. He was, by every social measure, ruined. The whispering against him continued for the rest of his life. In 1810, he attempted to clear his name in a long memorandum that survives among Samuel Henley's papers. The line most often quoted from it reads, "I have done nothing of which I should be ashamed. I was 13. The memorandum was never published, In 1811, fresh charges were brought against Kitty in London, this time involving allegations of his own. He did not wait for the magistrates. He boarded a ship at Bristol and sailed for New York. He never returned to England. He lived for the next 24 years in lodgings in New York and in Paris, supported by a remittance from his cousins at Powderham, writing letters home that no one in the family was permitted to read in public. He died alone in a Paris boarding house on 14th of May 1835 of pneumonia at the age of 67. His body was returned to England and buried in the Courtenay vault beneath the Powderham Chapel. The Devon earldom, which had been informally his after a successful Privy Council claim in 1831 to an older barony of Courtenay of Powderham, passed to his cousin William Courtenay, who became the 10th Earl of Devon, and the letters Kitty had sent home from New York and from Paris were placed in a sealed cupboard in the medieval tower, in the bedroom in which Lord Loughborough had once found a letter by William Beckford, and the cupboard was locked, and the key was lost or hidden, and for the next 145 years the letters lay undisturbed in the dark. The Courtenays of the 19th century inherited a damaged house. The 10th Earl, restored to the earldom in 1831 in his own right by a successful claim on an older barony, was a cautious man who avoided London and concentrated on agricultural improvement on the Powderham estate. His successors followed the same pattern. The Courtenays became known in Devon as quiet, country, hands-on landowners, devoted to the parish and to the deer park and to the fortunes of the local fishing fleet at Starcross. They were also, by the time the great agricultural depression hit Britain in the 1880s, running out of money. In 1923, the 14th Earl of Devon, faced with the second great wave of death duties in 20 years and a roof on the medieval tower that was actively shedding lead, took the decision that would have been unthinkable to his Georgian grandfather. He opened part of Powderham Castle to paying visitors. The first guidebook was printed locally in Exeter. The ticket price was 1 shilling and 6pence. Visitors were shown the marble hall, the music room, the library, and the grand staircase. They were not shown the bedroom in the medieval tower. The Beckford letter and the Kitty exile letters were not mentioned in the guidebook. The official line, repeated by the guides for the next 80 years, was that the 9th Earl had been driven into exile by the strain of a long disputed earldom claim and the burdens of a sensitive temperament. The Second World War brought further pressure. Powderham was requisitioned in November 1940 as a convalescent home for wounded soldiers and naval personnel. The Marble Hall was used as a recreation room. The music room held 30 hospital beds. The library became a nursing station. The medieval tower was closed off and used for storage. 98 soldiers passed through Powderham between 1940 and 1945. 2 died in the music room of complications from earlier wounds. A government inspector from the Ministry of Works recorded, in a report dated 12th of March 1943, that the heating system had failed in 3 rooms in the winter of 1942, that the lead on the southwest turret had begun to peel back in the gales of February 1943, that 16 panes of glass in the South Range had been shattered by the concussion of a stray German bomb that had fallen on Powderham Marsh in May 1942, and that the estimated cost of putting the building back into pre-war condition would be £18,400, a sum the Courtenays did not have. The family moved into the smaller wing on the riverfront and lived there for the duration of the war, in 3 rooms, with 1 servant, a Devon woman called Eliza Crocker, who had served the family for 27 years. In 1959, Hugh Courtenay, the 18th Earl of Devon, inherited at the age of 17. His father, the 17th Earl, had died of cancer at 51. Hugh inherited a leaking castle, a depleted bank account, and a family history that no one in his immediate circle had ever discussed with him in plain English. He was educated at Eton, served in the Coldstream Guards, married in 1967, and ran Powderham for the next 59 years as a working country estate. He opened the deer park to the public. He licensed the castle for weddings. He hosted a music festival in the meadow that drew 30,000 people a year, by the late 1990s. He did not open the medieval tower bedroom. He did not authorize any biographical work on William Beckford or Kitty Courtenay. When asked by a journalist from the Devon Life magazine in 1987 about the so-called Powderham affair, he said only that it was a private family matter from a long time ago and that he had nothing to add. It fell to his son to break the silence. Charles Courtenay was born in 1975 and educated at Eton and Oxford and Berkeley. He had qualified as a barrister in California, married a Californian actress, and lived for a time in Los Angeles before returning to take up the role of heir at Powderham in the early 2010s. He was the first Courtenay heir in 200 years to have been raised at any distance from the castle. He returned to it with the eye of a stranger. He read the Powderham guidebooks. He noticed what was not in them. In 2015, with his father's quiet agreement, he began to commission research into the Beckford scandal and into the life and exile of Kitty Courtenay. In 2017, in the course of cataloguing the contents of the medieval tower, the castle archivist found a sealed cupboard in an upper room. In the bedroom, traditionally identified as Kitty's, the lock was broken. The cupboard contained a bound volume of letters in Kitty Courtenay's hand, sent from New York and Paris between 1812 and 1835, addressed to his sisters and cousins at Powderham. The letters had been kept, against the wishes of more than one 19th century Courtenay, by the housekeeper Margaret Lacy in 1872, and forgotten thereafter. Charles read them in the marble hall over the spring of 2008. They are now on display there in a glass case, open to one of the longer New York letters. But the house that astonishes the 200,000 visitors who walk through the deer park every summer was not built by the earls whose names are carved on the chimney pieces of the music room. It was built and rebuilt and kept warm and lit and weather-tight for 6.5 centuries by the men and women who emptied the grates, carried the bags, mended the lead, cooked the dinners, and emptied the chamber pots. Their presence at Powderham is documented, recorded in ink on paper, entered in the estate books that survive in the Devon Record Office in Exeter. Their stories are not. There was a footman called Robert Ralph who came to Powderham in 1782 at the age of 17. He was the second son of a Kenton labourer. His name appears in the household ledger in October 1782 at a wage of 8 guineas a year, plus livery, plus a half guinea at Christmas. He was the footman on duty in the medieval tower corridor on the evening of the June 1784 midsummer party. The household records preserve, in a clean hand, the entry R. Ralph, attendance, tower stairs, the night of the Beckford affair. It is the only documentary trace of his witness. The next morning, he carried Mr. Beckford's leather travelling cases from the tower lodging to the courtyard chaise. He served at Powderham for 28 more years. He was promoted in 1795 to under-butler. He died in the village of Kenton in 1812 and was buried in the churchyard. We know he was illiterate. We know he had a wife named Mary and 3 surviving children. We know he never married above his station and never spoke, in any record that survives, about what he had seen on the tower stairs. We know nothing else. There was a butler called Edward Bullock who entered service at Powderham in 1830 and served the 8th and 9th Earls until 1850. He was paid £60 a year by 1840, a high wage for a country butler, which the household accounts justify on the grounds of unusually long service in a difficult post. His specific duty, recorded in a note in the 9th Earl's hand in the household books for 1834, was the maintenance of the bedroom in the medieval tower in the condition in which it had been left in 1811. The bed was made up weekly. The fire was laid each October. The window catches were oiled each spring. Kitty's letters, brought back across the Atlantic with his body in 1835, were placed in the cupboard beside the bed, and the door was closed. Edward Bullock refused on 3 documented occasions between 1837 and 1845 the suggestion that the room be cleared. When his successor took over in 1850, the room was unchanged. Edward Bullock retired to Topsham in 1850. We know he had a daughter who married a sailor. We know nothing else. There was a housekeeper called Margaret Lacy who arrived at Powderham in 1850 and managed the household for 30 years. She was a widow from Crediton. She was paid £40 a year. In 1872, she conducted an inventory of the medieval tower and found, in the cupboard by the bed, the bound volume of Kitty Courtenay's Letters from America and Paris, the 10th Earl's widow. Then the Dowager Countess instructed her to burn them. Margaret Lacy did not burn them. She catalogued them in her own hand in a notebook that is now held in the Devon Record Office. She returned the letters to the cupboard, locked it, and recorded the location. She died at Powderham in 1880. We know she had no children. We know she walked to chapel every Sunday in Kenton. We know she saved the letters that the family had wanted destroyed. We know nothing else. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. Robert Ralph saw the night that broke the Courtenays, kept Kitty's empty bedroom for 20 years. Margaret Lacy saved Kitty's letters from the fire. We know only that they were there, that the house they served is still standing, that the letters survive because Margaret Lacy decided in 1872 that they should, and that their names survived, some of them, because the Courtenay Estate Office kept its books, and nobody threw the ledgers away. In 2018, on a warm Saturday in May, Charles Courtenay, by then the 19th Earl of Devon, married his American husband AJ in the Marble Hall at Powderham. 250 guests. The Reverend Canon of Exeter Cathedral officiated. The wedding was the first marriage of an openly gay sitting earl to a man in English history. It was reported in the national press and in the New York Times. It was held, by the choice of both grooms, in the room where the 18th Earl had received his guests, where the 14th Earl had first welcomed paying visitors in 1923, and where the Bathstone columns rise on the same medieval foundations Sir Philip Courtenay had laid down in 1390. A year later, in 2019, the official Powderham guidebooks were rewritten. The Beckford scandal was named for the first time on every public tour. The training script for the volunteer guides, which runs to 14 pages, was approved by Charles Courtenay personally in March 2019 and gives the dates, the names, and the line about the grammatical mistake without softening any of them. Visitors were now taken, by appointment, to the medieval tower bedroom. The bound volume of Kitty's letters was placed in a glass case in the marble hall. The wall card read in plain words that William Beckford had been driven out of England in 1785 because he had loved a 13-year-old boy at Powderham and had written a letter that said so, and that the boy had grown up and been driven out of England in his turn, and that the house had kept the letters in a sealed cupboard for 145 years, until a housekeeper's notebook was found and a sealed door was opened. 200,000 people pass through Powderham every year now. They come for the wedding open days, of which the castle hosts 40 a year, at an average commercial fee of £9,000. They come for the music festival in the Deer Park, which has been running since 1996, and which draws between 30 and 40,000 people across one summer weekend. They come for the beer festival in the courtyard. They come for the Christmas market and the Easter egg hunt and the Halloween ghost tour and the open air cinema in August. The castle is run as a commercial enterprise by a small charitable trust set up by the 18th Earl in 2003, with Charles and AJ Courtenay at the heart of it, and an annual visitor income now sufficient to underwrite the repairs to the lead on the southwest turret that the 18th Earl could only afford to patch. The current annual restoration cost runs at around £400,000, balanced against a visitor income of around £2.5 million. The medieval tower is structurally sound for the first time in 2 centuries. The 19th Earl, when asked in 2020 by a journalist from the Telegraph what it had meant to read his ancestor Kitty's letters at last, said only that it had felt like a debt being paid. The castle has its own ghost story now for the tourists. The duty staff who work in the medieval tower late in the season say that the bedroom in which Lord Loughborough found the letter sometimes feels colder than the rooms on either side of it, even when the heating is on, and that the door does not always stay closed. Powderham today is the only English castle to have remained in one family from 1390 to the present day, 634 years and counting, through 3 changes of dynasty on the throne, 2 regicides, a civil war, and attainder, the slow agricultural depression of the 1880s, 2 world wars, a sexual scandal that drove 2 heirs into exile, the death duties that gutted the English country house in 1923 and again in 1951, and the slow erosion of the English aristocracy as a political class. The Courtenays absorbed all of it. They lost the earldom for 275 years. They lost their senior line to the Tudor scaffold. They lost their heir to a Paris boarding house. They lost their pre-war income to 2 waves of duty. They did not lose the castle. The sandstone wall above the salt marsh is still there. The crenellations are still ornamental. The fallow deer are still descended from the medieval stock. Stand at the east front of Powderham on a June afternoon. Stand at the east front of Powderham on a June afternoon, where the sandstone wall rises above the salt marsh in the soft Devon light, and look up at the medieval tower. The original tower house, Sir Philip Courtenay, raised between 1390 and 1410, 3 stories of red Permian sandstone with crenellations softened by 6 centuries of Atlantic weather. And you will see on the first floor a row of 3 lancet windows, and you will know that one of those windows belongs to the bedroom in which Lord Loughborough found a letter on a midsummer evening in 1784, and from which a footman called Robert Ralph carried William Beckford's leather cases to a waiting chaise the following morning. And you may also notice, if you look closely, that the lead on the southwest turret has been replaced in patches of slightly paler grey, where the 19th Earl had it repaired in 2019, and that the stone of the staircase courtyard windowsill on the southern face is faintly paler than the stones around it, because that sill was recut in 1956 after a storm cracked it, and that the cracks of 6 centuries are still there if you look for them under the lichen, under the soft Devon light. Powderham is not one house. It is the record in red Permian sandstone and Bath limestone and the slate of 2,720 roof tiles of 6 centuries of one family's decisions about what to keep, what to throw away, and what to lock in a cupboard and forget. Sir Philip wanted a tower on a strip of marsh. The house gave him a tower. Henry Courtenay wanted to be king. The house gave him an attainder. William Beckford wanted Kitty. The house gave him exile and Fonthill Abbey and 300 feet of falling masonry in 1825. Kitty wanted a quiet life. The house gave him America and a Paris boarding house and a sealed cupboard. The 14th Earl wanted to keep the castle. The house gave him paying visitors and a leaking roof. Hugh Courtenay wanted silence. The house gave him 59 years of it. Charles Courtenay wanted the truth. The house gave him a bound volume of letters in a cupboard a housekeeper had refused to empty in 1872. The house gave them all what they asked of it in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great country house accustomed to absorbing human weather. The house always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. Robert Ralph carried the bags down the tower stairs the morning after the letter was found. Edward Bullock kept the bed made up, and the fire laid for 20 years after the boy who slept in it had fled to America. Margaret Lacey took out a sealed cupboard inventory in 1872, ignored the Dowager Countess's instruction to burn the papers, catalogued the letters in her own hand in a notebook she kept in the housekeeper's room, and locked the door behind her. The Courtenays opened the door in 2017. The volume was lifted out and read. And the visitors come. Who does a building belong to? The Courtenay's 6th son, who built the tower on a strip of marsh in 1390, or the Marquis, who lost his head in 1538, or the Beckford boy, who wrote a letter he should not have written in 1784, or the boy who received it and died alone in Paris in 1835, or the footman who carried the bags down the stairs the next morning, or the housekeeper who refused to burn the letters in 1872, or the Earl who married his husband in the Marble Hall in 2018, or the 200,000 visitors who pay their entrance fee every summer and walk between the Bath stone columns and out across the deer park to the river. Powderham does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands on its strip of harder ground at the edge of the marsh, in the soft Devon light, with the curlews calling across the salt marsh, and lets you decide. In the marble hall, in a glass case under low light, the bound volume of Kitty Courtenay's letters lies open at a page from New York in 1818. The handwriting is neat and small and tired. The page is yellowed. The letters were written on cheap paper because Kitty had run out of his remittance for the quarter. They sat in a sealed cupboard in the medieval tower for 145 years, kept there by the curated memory of one housekeeper who refused to do as she was told. They are still up there. They always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.